Okay, good afternoon to those of you in person and those online and those on our YouTube page. We will start now because I think we should reward punctuality. We will hope that others will join us later. I will wait for the music to die down a little bit and then I'll continue. Okay. So good afternoon once again. Today we have a joint seminar being co-presented by the Center for Social Policy Studies, the Gender Equitable and Transformative Social Policy for a Post-COVID Africa. That's a project being run out of the Institute of African Studies and funded by Open Society. So that is why on our flyer you see CSPS, Center for Social Policy Studies, as well as the GETSPA project out of IAS, Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. So the topic today on Zambia. I'd like to just say finally that Ghana and Zambia are good countries to focus on right now because we know that both countries are deep into IMF debt restructuring. And in fact, GETSPA had a webinar some months ago specifically on these countries and debt restructuring. So this is providing another perspective on these two countries that are deep into economic crisis to see whether there is a way out. So Hangala, you're very welcome.
All right, good afternoon. I hope I'm audible enough. All right, thank you very much, Director. And thank you to the Center for the invitation. And thank you for the collaboration with GETSPA and the Institute for African Studies. Okay, sure. Do I have my PowerPoint? Okay, while I'm waiting for the PowerPoint to be uploaded, let me begin by way of brief background of the project. So the project is part of the Worldwide University Network project intended to promote collaboration between different universities on the continent, including University of Cape Town and University of Ghana. And the intention really is to be to think collaboratively about knowledge generation between different countries on the continent. And one important thing about Ghana, we know a lot about Ghana being a model democratic country on the African continent. Model democratic country, and in addition to being a model democratic country, we know it to be a country well endowed in mineral wealth and petroleum wealth. And in addition to that, we've learned through the literature that in Ghana, the government from 2008 up to date, have managed to find a way of ensuring that mineral wealth can accrue in order to promote pro-poor development. Now, with that being a model, how can any other country on the continent learn from Ghana? And therefore, I'll be giving a comparative in that regard. But to begin with, let me give an overview of the problem that we are confronted by. If you look at the world map and the level of poverty on the globe, you identify from the map that the majority of poor people on the continent, on the globe, are found in the African continent. In total, 413 million people are reportedly living below the poverty line in Africa. And collectively, are you able to move the slide for me? Yeah, and collectively, the level of poverty on the African continent is accounting for more than half the level of poverty globally. But even though we have that knowledge of the African continent having a very high level of poverty, we are aware of the fact that on the African continent, nearly every country is endowed with mineral wealth, oil, and any other kind of natural resource that ordinarily should be linked to promoting human welfare. Now, on the right of the screen, and forgive me for the font not being large enough, but what we have there is a diagram showing the level of rent per capita, meaning the proportion of revenue accruing from natural resource wealth divided by the population of the country. And if you look at that graph, and again, I apologize for it not being clear enough, countries like Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Congo Republic, Angola tend to rate very highly in terms of countries that have very high rent per capita, but they equally tend to be countries that are quite undemocratic and tend to have a high level of income inequality. So the question then that follows is, could I move to the next slide? Yeah. If we have to look at the relationship between mineral wealth and the level of human development, what kind of relationship do we identify? So in the graph that I have over here, basically we have the Human Development Index measuring the level of human well-being in terms of education and health and income. And at the same time, we are trying to match that with, if you compare the level of resource rent that a country had, what kind of bivariate relationship do you get? So generally, countries like Ghana and Zambia are both, generally both have fairly levels of high resource rent and equally have fairly high levels, medium levels of human development. Compared to countries like Gabon, which have very high levels of resource rent, but equally high levels of human development. And then you have a country like Equatorial Guinea, the GNQ, which on the resource rent is nearly an 8, but on the human development is only 0.5. So very high levels of natural resource rent, but very low level of, or fairly low level of human development. So the general background is that the World Bank argue that though the African continent has a lot of natural abundant wealth, it's very difficult for that wealth to be tied to improving actual human conditions on the continent. And part of the argument is that the type of regime that you have in a country will have implications for whether you have an effective way of channeling mineral wealth to promoting human development. With that argument being that a democratic country might be better able to make that link between ensuring that mineral revenue will accrue to promoting human development. So there are two main questions which I want to look at today. And one will be do resource-rich African democracies have a way or institutional means of promoting pro-poor spending? Meaning, do we identify a direct linkage between the revenue they collect from mining or from mineral wealth and what they're able to do to promote human development? And I'm going to narrow that down to two African countries. One, Ghana, that I refer to as a model African democratic country, and Zambia, another country which is equally democratic, but not at the level that Ghana would be rated to be democratic. And I'll show what I mean by that. So when you look at the two countries, Ghana generally, to begin with, the national poverty head count is 23%, meaning that only 1/4 of the population are believed to be living below the poverty line, compared to Zambia, where it's 54%, meaning more than half the population are considered to be living below the poverty line. But Ghana also has a higher level of human development, and it has a higher level of democratic rating. Freedom House have a way of rating a country based on a number of indicators to determine how democratic or not democratic that country may be. And you're either classified to be a free country, to be partly free, or to be not free. So Ghana is considered to be a free country. And there are only about 5 other countries on the continent that are regarded to be free. The others being Cape Verde, South Africa, Botswana, and I believe Namibia. Those are countries which are believed to have a very high level of freedom on the African continent. So Ghana, again, I reiterate, democratic country, very high level of freedom, relatively low level of population living below the poverty head count, and democratic to the degree that you've had electoral alternation in Ghana between one political party to another. In 2000, the transition from Jerry Rawlings to John Kufuor. 2008, the National Democratic Congress came back into power, and 8 years ago, the NPP came back into power. So electoral alternation is usually regarded as an indicator of how democratic a country is. And electoral alternation is equally regarded to be good for promoting human development, in that every time you have a new government being elected into power, the political leadership are aware that the public voted the previous party out of power due to the fact that they were clearly not delivering, and therefore they have a motivation to then vote for a new political party that will presumably do more. And therefore, a new political party is argued will have motivation to actually provide more social welfare benefits than the government that had been in power before. But Zambia is equally a country to have had multiple electoral alternations, including in 2021, when a new government came into power, largely due to the fact that the government that had been in power before was deemed to have run down the economy and gotten to a point, as the director mentioned, where now the country is having to rely on IMF and an IMF bailout and World Bank funding in order to fund their national budget, or part of the national budget, not the entirety of the budget. But getting back to my earlier point about trying to link mineral wealth and human development, here's a graph or a bar chart showing the contribution of mining and quarrying, 1 to GDP, 2 to exports of the country, and thirdly to actual government revenue, meaning the proportion of mineral revenue that will actually accrue to the national budget. Now, I deliberately do not include petroleum or oil wealth when calculating the contribution for Ghana, due to the fact that while Ghana do have minerals like gold, Zambia doesn't have copper and cobalt, but not oil. So I thought it would be a better way of comparing to limit it to mining rather than combining mining and petroleum, even though later on I do refer to what's happening with petroleum in Ghana. The key takeaway from the bar chart is that Ghana actually has a lower level of mineral wealth accruing to the total GDP of the country relative to Zambia. And it also had a lower proportion of mining contributing to its export revenue. But it had, at 48%, it had more revenue accruing to the government from mining. So in short, the government in Ghana has a better framework for ensuring that they are collecting revenue, even though the Zambian government is technically generating as a percentage of the mining revenue, is actually generating more in terms of GDP. So already that is giving you a picture that there's something Ghana is doing right here for it to be able to have more revenue accruing to the government account. I mean, when we go further, it will be another debate, right? The fact that government are accruing more revenue, will that guarantee that that revenue is actually leading to actual human development outcome? That would be another question to think about as we go forward. But what we know about how revenues from mining are actually spent and allocated in Ghana. So to begin with, all revenues accrued by the Ghanaian government, not only in mining, but they all go into a consolidated fund, meaning when government collects revenue, it will go into one pool or one account, which will then fund the national budget. But mineral royalties, there's a component of mineral royalties that's paid into the mineral investment fund, out of which 20% is allocated to the mineral income investment fund, out of which 20% will be allocated to the mineral development fund, with the idea being that the communities in which mining happens should be able to benefit directly from the revenue or from the mining happening in that particular community. So part of that 20% will end up with the local authorities, who would then be able to promote local development projects aimed at empowering people in the community where mining has actually happened. But in addition to that, and I mentioned earlier that even though I didn't look at the contribution of petroleum, the available information shows that 30% of petroleum revenue are allocated to the Ghana Stabilization Fund, meaning that the government accrue a certain amount of money that during a period of low oil revenue, there's some money that can then allow them to plow back into the national budget and do whatever they need to do to promote pro-poor development or pro-poor spending. And additionally, I want to mention the fact that in Ghana, there's a policy of free education, which from 2017 had now been extended to secondary school. And that free education is actually funded primarily through the consolidated fund. And the point I'm making here is that you're not able to actually identify a very clear linkage between mineral revenue and funding of the free education, even though the idea is that all the money in the consolidated fund ultimately is coming from all the different contributions of revenue. But you also have a component of 4%, which is coming from development partners. So you can think of your World Bank and your other UN agencies or your UK Department for International Development, which all tend to play a role in promoting development in the African continent. But with regard to social protection, which is actually now my area of interest and the area that I work in primarily. So in Ghana, you have the Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty program, LEAP, which I'm sure many of you may be familiar with and know much more than I would. And LEAP was introduced in 2008. And the idea was to provide income support to poor households that cannot afford to take themselves out of poverty. And there were three main categories of people that were targeted by the LEAP program. So a poor household with orphaned and vulnerable children, with elderly people who are poor and cannot afford to look after themselves, and people who are severely disabled and therefore cannot work. But the actual amount paid is anywhere ranging between 11 and 18 American dollar equivalent, depending on the number of people that are benefiting from the LEAP payment. Meaning that if there are 4 or more people in a household, then they are more likely to get the higher amount of 18. And if only one beneficiary, then it will be the lower amount of 11. Importantly, how is the LEAP program actually funded? Well, it's funded half of it through the government of Ghana, through the national budget. Again, money through the consolidated fund. But the other half is funded through a combination of what had been until about 2020 called the United Kingdom Department for International Development, now called the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and through a World Bank loan, meaning the other half, DFID and World Bank combined to provide funding for the LEAP program. And related to the general theme of my presentation, already you're identifying one thing. Here's a country well endowed with natural resource wealth, and yet half of the funding for the social protection, the flagship social protection program, is actually funded through international partners, including a loan, which will have to be repaid. So that begs the question, why don't we have better mechanisms to ensure that mineral revenue can actually contribute directly to funding LEAP in full? So currently, 350,000 households are benefiting from the LEAP program. But in a population of 34 million, and I forgot to do the calculation, but I imagine 350,000 households in a population of 34 million. Well, obviously you have to take into account the proportion of people who are living below the poverty line, but I imagine that the scale might be a bit more. But more importantly, different academics have looked at the impact of the LEAP program to try and determine whether the program is having the intended benefits. And a number of issues have been identified which bring into question the impact of the program. One of them is that the money paid to beneficiaries is quite inadequate. And a grant of $18 equivalent for a family of 4 or more paid bi-monthly is deemed to be inadequate to actually meaningfully move people out of poverty. Additionally, there have been reports of payments not being made on time, meaning if you're having a bi-monthly payment, if you get a payment in January, get another payment in March, another payment in May, but there have been occasions when, maybe there are 4 months of money not being actually paid, and you are take into account that the population that are being targeted are already vulnerable population groups, meaning that if they go a long duration without being paid their benefits, in addition to the fact that they are already living below the poverty threshold, there's actually a potential for their vulnerability to be increased rather than to actually be mitigated. And a third challenge identified, so the beneficiaries of the LEAP program are equally entitled to benefit from the National Health Insurance Services, meaning that they should be able to get free medical attention. But in actual fact, evaluations have shown that there are usually difficulties in them actually benefiting from the free medical benefits. Meaning on paper, it should be that way, but in reality, it's not a given or guaranteed. Another point that I wish to mention is that you do have a Ghana fertilizer subsidy program targeting farmers. And that program appears to be more popular with the political elite. It targets about 8 times more people than the LEAP program. And one argument can be made, maybe not from my knowledge of Ghana, but from my knowledge of Zambia and Malawi, that usually programs that are targeting agriculture are more popular electorally. One, because farmers tend to be a much larger voting population than the people benefiting from programs like LEAP. And equally due to the fact that the people who benefit from farming are usually the active poor, people who are active enough to mobilize during campaign period, as opposed to the orphaned and vulnerable children, the elderly who are probably too old to go and frail to go out and campaign, and the people with severe disability. So there's an argument from the work I've done in other countries that farm input subsidies are very popular because they have a direct link to electoral support. But I'm not currently sure if that's true with Ghana, but I'll be happy to hear your view during the Q&A. So now I introduce the comparative case. So Zambia is a bit different in that all mining revenues are paid into the equivalent of the consolidated fund. The challenge with that is when revenue goes into the government account, individual revenue loses its identity, given that you are not able to then know to say if the government are allocating 40% of the, if they're allocating 10% of the budget to education, you won't know for sure how much of that money came from a donor funding component, how much of it came from a from revenue. Of course, the treasury will have that information, but for the ordinary individual to go looking for that information, it can be a bit challenging, and therefore the general public would not be able to actually know how revenues are actually allocated in order to fund different poor development programs. More importantly, Ghana, like I indicated, have the Mineral Development Fund and actually promulgated a Mineral Development Act intended to ensure that there's clarity about regarding how much mineral wealth should be allocated to local authorities in order to promote development at the local level. Zambia doesn't have the equivalent of that, where you actually have a very clear link between revenue from mining companies. You don't have an act guaranteeing that that money will accrue to a particular sector or to a particular local authority. The government has also talked about introducing a stabilization fund equivalent to what Ghana have. But even though the idea had been mooted from around 2012, 2013, the government that had actually mooted that idea got kicked out in 2021. And I'm yet to know whether the new government will have an equivalent idea that will be implemented. So mining companies do contribute to their local authorities, obviously through land rates and other levies that have to be paid to the local authorities where they operate. And the local authorities can then determine what to do with that revenue. But you do not actually have a very clear legislation indicating that this much money from mineral revenue should go to that sector of the economy or should go to that area of development. Now, the Zambian government does have a free education policy as well, which came into effect in 2021, but it's actually funded through a combination of money that comes through World Bank loans. As the director indicated, the government is currently negotiating with the IMF for debt restructuring, and the World Bank have been trying to help the government in order to ensure that pro-poor spending is not affected by the measures that they have to implement in order to get a bailout and get the country out of the debt that they have. From 2021, the Zambian government had also been recruiting a number of teachers and healthcare workers. That information will become important towards the end of my presentation when I begin to show public opinion toward the government handling of education and health. And importantly, development partners continue to promote other initiatives like a program aimed at encouraging young girls to remain in school and another school feeding youth program, which are funded by the World Bank and the World Food Program, respectively. So comparing that to Ghana, again, you see a common pattern of development partners playing a very important role in promoting pro-poor spending, even when these are countries which are highly endowed with the natural resource wealth. So coming to the social cash transfer program, the equivalent of the LEAP program. So it had been in effect from 2003, meaning it's a bit older than LEAP. And it equally pays bi-monthly benefit to the 10% poorest individuals in the country. And the targeting criteria is very much like LEAP. They target individuals who are coming from households where they are female, headed by elderly, or where they have individuals with severe disability, or orphaned and vulnerable children. The beneficiary amounts are not unlike what is paid in Ghana. They range from between a low of $9 per month to a high of 18, depending on if they have an individual living with a disability. Meaning if they do not have an individual with a disability, they get the lower amount. But if they do, then they get paid the higher amount. And currently, from 2020, the government is funding the program at up to 30% of the program is funded through the main government revenue. And the World Bank and the IDA, which is a component of the World Bank, is pretty much funding about 2/3 of the current budget for the cash transfer program, while development partners like your UK Department for International Development are paying 1/10 of the budget. So the implication again is that here you have a program that's primarily donor-driven, notwithstanding the fact that it's a country that is endowed in natural resource wealth. But again, the $9 to $8 monthly grant has been deemed to be inadequate to deal with the high levels of poverty in the country. And there's a report that has showed that actually it would take about $70 equivalent per month in order for a household to meaningfully move out of poverty. Another challenge with the cash transfer program is that the budget for the cash transfer program falls under what is called discretionary spending, meaning that the government only fund the program as and when they can afford to fund it. Meaning if their priorities are to fund agricultural subsidies or any other program that they might deem to be more important, by law, they cannot be held liable for not funding the program, and the beneficiaries will have to wait for when the government have the money to actually pay the program. And like Ghana, the Zambian government also spends heavily on a farmer input support program. And in other work that I have done, I've actually showed that between 2011 and 2021, the government would actually spend more than 800% of the money allocated to the farmer input support program budget, meaning what they allocated to the budget, or what they allocated for the program in the budget, and the money that was actually spent on the program in a year. In one particular year, it was 800% more that was actually paid out than what had actually been budgeted. Even though with the social cash transfer program, in 2019, it was only 15% of the money budgeted that was actually paid out. So already you see that there's a priority here in terms of, do you fund your farmer input program, or do you fund your programs like your LEAP, which are intended to benefit the very poor? So what comparative lessons can we draw? And this is obviously very preliminary. So I indicated earlier that Ghana is regarded to be a model in the African country. And in terms of this comparison, it's actually proving that, a higher percentage of revenue are accruing to the government, even though mining is contributing more to GDP and export in Zambia. More importantly, Ghana has gone a long way in terms of having legislation like the Mineral Development Act and the Mineral Development Fund, which guarantee a minimum level of funding for mineral revenue to go to funding poor development intervention. But both countries continue to be quite dependent on donor funding for their social cash transfer program, which is part of my main concern in terms of why we continue to be quite dependent on donor funding many years after being independent and many years after being able to generate wealth from their own mineral revenue. The other challenge, like I indicated, both of them, both LEAP and the cash transfer program, are deemed to be insufficient, meaning that they are implemented, beneficiaries are added every year to the program, but in reality, the actual impact they're having on poverty may be not as high as we would like it to be. I mean, there are different impact evaluation reports which will show that people are able to have an additional meal a day. People are able to own an additional asset, whether it be an additional goat or an additional chicken. So you have that kind of information. But the other reports which are challenging whether the actual beneficiary amounts are really making a dent in dealing with poverty. And another final point that I make in looking at both countries, that political support appears to be leaning more toward agricultural intervention, which, as I hypothesized, probably has a lot more to do with the fact that electorally, farming communities tend to be more strategic for any political party wishing to remain in power, particularly in a competitive electoral environment where that power can change hands between one political party and another. I mean, Ghana goes for an election in 2024, and therefore, the NPP, which has been in power or would have been in power for the 8th year, will definitely be looking to hold on to power and therefore be looking to target constituencies within the country that will be crucial for keeping it in power. And it might be that agriculture might be viewed to be a very important economic sector in order to retain power. So here I just want to look at Afrobarometer data. Sure, many of you might be familiar with Afrobarometer. They conduct public opinion data on issues to do with democracy and development in up to 40 African countries now. And in their 8th round conducted between 2019 and 2021, they had a question asking people, how well or badly would you say the current government is handling addressing education in the country? Now, when you look at a range of African countries, I think there are about 19 or 20 that I look at in the chart here. Ghana is actually among the top 4 performing countries on the continent, meaning that more than 70% of the people in Ghana believe that the Ghanaian government was handling education very well. And keep in mind that this was in 2019, sorry. Zambia was a bit lower than that, but above the average for the African continent. Again, Afrobarometer had a question, how well do you think the government are handling improving healthcare? And again, Ghana performed very well. It's again among the top 5 performing countries on the continent, behind Benin, Kenya, Botswana, Eswatini, and Tanzania. And again, Zambia is lagging further behind, but also above the average. But Afrobarometer recently conducted their 9th round, which was conducted in 2022. And what's interesting now is when you look at the comparison between the 8th round and the 9th round. So in the 8th round, there are questions about how well you think the government is handling managing the economy, improving the living standard of the poor, and job creation. And at the time, about 52% in 2019 in Ghana thought that the government was doing well with managing the economy, compared to only 24% in Zambia. Then a new government came in Zambia, and by the 2022 round, in Ghana, only 90% now think that the government is doing well at managing the economy, which is quite a sharp drop between 2019 and 2022. And I'll be happy to hear more about why that drop has happened in a very short period of time. And even with regard to creating jobs, in 2019, 38% of people in Ghana thought the government was doing very well at job creation. That has dropped now to about 18 or 19%. Improving living conditions from 41 to about 15%. Huge drop in a very short period of time. So coming back to the earlier point I was making, Ghana is this model of a democratic country in Africa, model of, a country with a good way of ensuring that mineral revenue can accrue to human development. But currently, it looks like people are not very happy with the management of the economy, improving living standard and creating jobs, which might actually be very worrying for the rest of us from other parts of the continent, given that we are looking to Ghana as the model, and now we are worried that you are not happy about how the country is being run. So then what should we be emulating from Ghana? So that has actually left me with, so my conclusion is really how to take the research going forward. And so one question that I want to be able to interrogate further is, why have Ghana and Zambia taken different development paths? What is it about Ghana that they had the vision to implement the Mineral Development Fund and do all the things they have done, which the counterpart has not been able to do? But importantly, if Ghana is really a model for other African countries to look at, how well is the model actually working? And to what degree should we be looking at Ghana as a country that we should be emulating? But thirdly, what link can we actually make to ensure that there are direct linkages between revenue and social protection spending? Because from what I've shown right now, it doesn't really look like they're very direct links, other than money going through the consolidated fund, but you don't actually have very direct, like the way you have the stabilization fund or the mineral development fund. We don't have that for social protection program. Can those links actually be made? And if they can, what would that take? Fourthly, is there a way of linking the benefits that social protection beneficiaries get with the actual cost of living? If people are being given a grant of $11 per month, and that might not be adequate to cover, living below the poverty line, then should there be a deliberate policy of linking the beneficiary amount to the cost of living? The counter argument to that would be, what happens when you have a fluctuation in commodity prices? What does the government then do? Do they again reduce the benefits? But those are conversations to begin to think about. And finally, a point that I've been making recurringly through my presentation is, what impact do competitive elections have on government spending priority? Ghana, we've had every 8 years, we believe that a new government will come into power. What does it mean in terms of what the priorities will be for a government that is fully aware that it can be kicked out, and therefore it has to give priority to what might keep it in power? How do we think about social protection spending within that broader context? Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you again for a very interesting presentation. I always have mixed feelings when we see Ghana being held up as a model. Because on the one hand, a bit of pride, on the other hand, is worrying, because I think people in Ghana don't feel like we're doing well. So it makes you wonder what's happening on the rest of the continent that you're looking to as the model. But there are lessons to be learned. I've asked the folks online to type their questions, or they have the option of raising their hand and we can call them up to ask their questions or make comments. Those of you in the room also, I hope that you have some reactions. I will ask mine first. I'm fascinated by always, but also in this case, by the politics of social policy making. So you talked about how much better funded agricultural support programs are in both countries. And that's intriguing because even the LEAP policy itself, I suspect, has a political, what's the word? Political dimension to it. In Ghana, it was something that was very much pushed by development partners. I think it's something that's beneficial to the country, and I'm sure most people would think that it is a kind of program that we should be doing and we should be funding better. But the push for it and a lot of the input into its content came from development partners. And I don't know whether you are aware of whether there's some kind of template that both Ghana and Zambia followed in terms of LEAP, and whether this is a kind of template that's being disseminated around the continent also, because we do have these instances of policy diffusion, right, where some policy dreamt up somewhere is offered to different African countries. So just any thoughts on that? Because it is also it does also have a political dimension, even though the politics of votes getting is somehow better in it. And along those lines, I just want to read one comment from Dr. Chibo Darko, who is also at the Center for Social Policy Studies. She says, under the current IMF support program, so our debt restructuring that we are in the middle of doing, Ghana is supposed to meet a specific target spending amount for social spending on interventions like LEAP. So this is one of the key indicators that's used to measure out the ability to receive tranches of the IMF loan facility. So I think that's also interesting that IMF is going to put a constraint on social spending, but somehow there are also targets for social spending at the same time. All of these, the politics of all of this sometimes gets me dizzy. I think I've given you a couple of things to think about. Should I add a few more questions and comments, or do you want to start with this?
I think let me begin with the two that I have.
Sure.
So the initial question you had about the template, to my knowledge, DFID, the UK Department for International Development, were very heavily involved in both LEAP and the cash transfer program, meaning you definitely have that diffusion of, the common template, if you may call it that. But obviously within each country, there are other international development partners who may have equally played an important role. Like the UNICEF have been very important in the Zambian case. The German technical cooperation equally played an important role in the initial formulation of the cash transfer program. So yeah, we do have development partners that pretty much have an idea that they implement in one country and then recommend to another country. And therefore you have overlap in terms of what the different countries are doing regarding who they target, the kind of beneficiary amount that they pay. You definitely have that overlap. The point about Ghana having, or rather the IMF recommending that a particular component should be targeted to social protection spending. That's very important information for me, and I'm very thankful to the contributor for that point. I do want to draw attention to a comparison on that point with the Zambian government. They too are going through an IMF program at the moment, and part of that program is that they should ensure funding to go to programs like the cash transfer program. But in reality, about half of the current funding is coming through a World Bank loan. So it comes back to the whole question of, yeah, the IMF debt restructuring can guarantee that a particular amount of money is paid to beneficiaries. But a key question here would be, where is the money actually coming from? Is it a loan that the World Bank and the IMF are giving to ensure that, you know, while the government is implementing austerity measures, the poor are not left behind? Or is it actually government revenue that are going to fund the program? Because if it's a loan, then over time, that money will have to be repaid. So again, it comes back. I would like to know more about whether Ghana are paying that through their own revenue or whether some facilities being offered to the government to pay that money.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you to come up. Please introduce yourself before you do your question.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm George Dumfe. I'm also a faculty of Center for Social Policy Studies. And I was going to talk about what Dr. Antipoda, my colleague, talked about regarding the current arrangement with an IMF and how they want us to, as it were, look more at the poor. You know, they don't want us to leave the poor behind, because the reason why we are here today, we all know why we came here. Indeed, about a month or so ago, I happened to be in their meeting, World Bank and IMF meeting of 191 countries, and we talked a lot about Zambia. You know, you were not doing so well compared to Ghana, actually. And so we talked about it all, and you could see that they are very serious this time. They want us to do more to help the poor, you know. And so talking about whether or not they are giving us a grant or loan, so the whole arrangement is this. Ghana, they are giving us 3 billion US dollars. And this money, you know, usually IMF will give you money to shore up your reserves. That has been the traditional approach. They give you money to shore up your reserve to protect your local currency, because you get into a situation where your central bank is not able to, as it were, supply enough foreign currencies to protect your currency. Ghana, for example, at the beginning of the year, $1 was going, last year, $1 was going for 6 cities, 20 pesos. October last year, $1 moved to 17 cities, you know, because of the pressures that came from global. We all understand what happened. And that's partly the reason why we had this problem. I mean, now, you know, Ghanaians are not happy because it wasn't good that at the beginning of the year, $1 going for 6 cities, 20 pesos. And by the 10th month, you were exchanging 70 cities for $1. And that affected everything because we import fuel. We produce fuel here, about 173,000 barrels a day. But we send everything in crude form to other countries to sell, US, and then we go to Holland and the other places to buy refined oil. So the moment global price goes up, it affects it directly. And we have deregulated that sector since 2006, meaning government doesn't have a hand in it. So the moment anything happens in the global market, it comes directly to affect it. And that's part of the reason why Ghanaians are not happy, as you rightly put it. But talking about whether it is a loan from World Bank, yeah, it is a loan. But, you know, as I said, traditionally, they want you to keep your money to swap up your reserves so you can protect your local currency. This time, they are asking us to, out of that money they are giving us, use some for budget support. Budget support means that part of it will be available to the finance ministry to run, to, you know, to take care of other things, just, like social intervention, you know, programs. So part of it is coming from the fund as in form of what? Budget support, something that was not usual of an IMF. And so it is part of the loan, but this one is budget support. We are not going to keep it at the Bank of Ghana. Bank of Ghana will extend part of it to Ministry of Finance, to take care of those things. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have somebody else. I believe I saw. Yes, Salifu M. Mohammed. So we're going to give you a chance to speak. Please unmute your mic and can you introduce yourself? Tell us where you're coming from and then go ahead with your question or comment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Dr. Salifu Mohammed. I'm of the Department of Teacher Education, University of Ghana. I want to congratulate the organizers of the program, at least for educating us. And I also want to congratulate the presenter, at least for letting us know what is happening in other parts of the African continent. If I listen to him, he said that Zambia is producing more mineral resources than Ghana, but Ghana appears to be getting more revenue compared to Zambia. And so Ghana appears to be doing something right that they want to emulate. In fact, I have listened to many experts, and they said that, in fact, the gold, diamond, and the mineral resources that are produced in Ghana, over 70% or 80% of the proceeds are retained in foreign countries, and that less than 30%, in fact, some people even say 10% or less than 10% of the proceeds actually come back to Ghana here. So for a country that is producing gold, diamond, and resources, and only getting about 10% of the proceeds, can it be said to be doing something right with its mineral resources? Again, currently, Ghana is on an IMF program to help it manage the economy. A country with mineral resources that does not have the revenue, the resources to support itself, but is relying on the IMF to support it, can it be said to be doing something right with its mineral resources? So I will add this, I will leave it now. If time allows, maybe I'll ask another question later on. Thank you very much.
Okay. You can choose to take that as a comment or something you want to respond to. And while you're thinking about that, let me add one from Eunice Agbenyazi, who's also at CSPS doing her PhD, but also with Star Ghana, which is an NGO that is very deeply involved in social protection and other social policy issues. She had a question about whether, I don't think this is a question for your presentation because it's one of those that says, did you look at other things? But I think she's pointing out that LEAP fulfills only the provision aspect of social protection. And she wants to point all of us to look at other areas of government funding that looks or that considers more the promotive aspects of social policy. Okay. And she does actually have a more specific question for you about needing to interrogate the Afrobarometer findings on the rating of governments on education. Did the questions look at both performance on access and quality? So I think the question is about what was the basis of the responses. Okay, so that's it for now, and then there'll be one more from the audience, and then we'll think about wrapping up.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you to the two comment, the comment in the room about the IMF loan and clarifying that. And unfortunately, I didn't get the entire comment from Dr. Salifu Mohammed, but I think she was making reference to the fact that Ghana might actually be getting or accruing a much lower percentage of mineral revenue than officially reported, which could be accounting for why they are now having to get a bailout. But I didn't get that comment in its entirety due to the connection. But coming to the question about AB data, I definitely agree that we need to be careful, mindful with how we interpret Afrobarometer data. I mean, the question on education is really a very broad question. You know, how well do you think the government are handling addressing education in the country? And I imagine that that question can be interpreted to include both the quality of education, you know, the performance of the education sector. So I agree that we need to be mindful, but either way, I think that it's a very useful indicator of what the public think, however they might be interpreting the meaning of how they think the government is handling education. Particularly if you look at the fact that when you look at the round 8 data in 2019 and the round 9 data in 2022, it's a very sharp decline in how people think the government is handling education. So clearly, by whatever understanding they have, clearly there's a concern that education is not being handled well enough. And I'll definitely look at the more promotive aspect of LEAP. I think there's more for me to take into account. I've taken note of that, and I'll look into that.
Okay, it looks to me that we have 2 questions. So we'll take one online from Dr. Pesawai, and then one in the room from Dr. Esther Siachiwena. So Mike?
Yes, so thank you very much. Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. Not too long ago, I sat in one, also comparing both Ghana and Zambia, also in the area of LEAP and then the expanded cash transfers in Zambia. And listening to you now, I have a very simple question. This notion that Ghana is doing well, Ghana is a model, Ghana is a poster child, Ghana is an exemplifier or an exemplar, is it taken as given, or should it be taken as given, or in a research of this kind, should it be interrogated a bit more to provide some specifics, both in terms of form and substance, so that we will know what indicators are being used to make Ghana the poster kid for comparison with other African countries. I mean, anything short of this really leaves the comparative work very hanging, and I don't know whether you've found a need to think about something like this at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very wonderful presentation. I'm Esther Siachiwena from the GESPA project. The general sense I had from your presentation is that there's a very grim prognosis on the extent to which resource wealth promotes human development. So based on this, I want to ask your expert opinion on this debate about universal basic incomes, given the context of the pandemic. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Jamila Mohammed, an MA student, Center for Social Policy Studies. Please, my question is like, through the presentation, the comparison between Ghana and then Zambia, it's like they see Ghana to be doing very well in the LEAP program. That is why we are a model. My question is it just because we roll it out earlier than they do, or because our impact assessment of the LEAP performance is what they are looking at? Is it because we are years ahead in rolling it out earlier than they do, or the assessment is based on the impact on the vulnerables?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll begin with that question and link it with the question that Professor Michael Pestner had. I think the point being made about Ghana being a model is actually not with regard to the implementing of the LEAP program, but in terms of it being a model democratic country and it being a model country in terms of having, you know, a mechanism to ensure that mineral revenues accrue to the poor. So your Mineral Development Fund, the MIIF, you know, the Ghana Stabilization Fund, those initiatives are what are regarded to be a model that other countries can emulate. And if you recall, toward the end of my presentation, I had further questions to interrogate, which is, should we take it for granted that Ghana is really a model? Because you can be a model in terms of what you're doing on paper, but are you a model in terms of what you're actually implementing? Yeah, and I think that's part of what I'm also trying to get at with my research here, that yes, we know Ghana to be a model in terms of what it has done, what people have written about it, particularly what people have written about it. And if you've never been to Ghana and you're only reading about Ghana, then you have a very good impression from what you're reading. But if we begin to go further to say, but what's the actual impact? You know, that's where now I begin to say we should then question whether Ghana is really the model. And beyond that, what should a model for that continent then look like? Yeah, and I don't have the answer to that question right now, but I think it's a point to further debate. The question, Esther, about universal basic income grant, I'm a bit conflicted on the UBI, partly due to the fact that from what I've shown so far, you know, you have LEAP paying, you know, $9 amount per month. So it's also a question of, if you're implementing the UBI, what's the model of it? What benefits are being paid to beneficiaries? Are we doing it just to be able to show that we have this universal basic income, even if it's paying a $5 grant per month? Or, you know, is it well thought through in order to ensure that it's really poverty targeted or linked to the cost of living? So I think context matters. It might matter from one country to another, but I think my personal view is that it's really about being able to make linkages between the actual cost of living and the kind of benefits that are paid to people living below the poverty line. And if a universal basic income grant can achieve that objective, then I would support that objective. But if it's implemented in a way that is not achieving that objective, then we might not be actually addressing an actual problem. That's my thought. Thank you.
Of their workday, so we don't want to take that for granted. This has been fascinating to me. We do definitely need more of these comparative studies of countries on the continent, which is something, as I said, GETSPA is very invested in. I think is very clarifying to be able to move from just looking at your country to seeing what similarities there might be between you and other countries. And of course, then it raises even more questions as your study does. But this is definitely the kinds of research that we need to be doing more of as we grapple with very similar issues, even if some of our contexts are different. So we hope to bring many more of these kinds of collaborative seminars between CSPS and GETSPA. The GETSPA project, it's continuing to put out its research findings, and I think we'll be able to get an even greater comparative analysis, right? Because they'll be looking at regions as well as continent-wide phenomenon on social policy. So it's only left for me to once again thank you for making the time and for coming all the way from South Africa to do this presentation. Thank you in-house and thank everybody on Zoom and YouTube. And we hope to bring you another seminar in 2 weeks, which will be entirely online this time. Thank you again and have a good afternoon.
And thank you for hosting me.